Welcome to our deep dive into infidelity. You've provided some really fascinating sources on this topic. Our mission is to help you understand all the nuances of betrayal. Why is it that the same action can trigger such vastly different reactions from different people?
Yeah, you're right. It's tempting to think that we can rank infidelity, like a one-night stand versus a long-term affair, for
Yeah.
example. But these sources show us that it's just not that simple. To really understand the impact, we need to go beyond the surface.
Okay, so let's unpack that. One of the first things that jumped out at me from the sources is this idea that there's no hierarchy of hurt when it comes to infidelity.
Yeah, it's a powerful insight, isn't it? The sources are just filled with stories that completely shatter the myth that the length of an affair directly correlates with the pain it causes. One example that really struck me was this woman who casually mentioned a decades-old fling to her husband, and it led to their immediate divorce after 30 years of marriage.
Wow, that's just a powerful example of how something seemingly in the past can have these explosive consequences. What's going on there? Why such a drastic reaction?
I think it highlights how shock, coupled with individual sensitivities, can just completely reshape a relationship's trajectory. It's a stark reminder that even when we think we know someone intimately, we can't predict how they'll react to a revelation like that. It also underscores that it's not just about the act itself, but it's about the shattering of trust and the resurfacing of past vulnerabilities.
Yeah, that makes me think about the other end of the spectrum. Stories where people demonstrate this remarkable resilience in the face of what we might consider major betrayals. I'm thinking of one source that described a husband who discovered a long-term affair but chose to stay in the marriage and work through it.
Yeah, that's where this concept of magnifiers and buffers becomes really helpful. The sources suggest that certain circumstances can either intensify the pain of infidelity or help to cushion the blow. Magnifiers can include things like pregnancy, financial dependence, or past experiences with betrayal. In the case of the husband who chose to stay, he had a very strong sense of self and also a supportive family network, which likely acted as buffers.
That's fascinating. So it's like having a safety net to catch you when you're feeling emotionally vulnerable. But the sources also show how the pain of infidelity can spread outwards, entangling friends and family, and even forcing the betrayed partner into this web of deceit.
Yes, it creates a ripple effect, doesn't it? Take the story of this woman who discovered her husband's 6-year affair with his secretary. She chose to keep it a secret for the sake of their children, essentially becoming complicit in the lie. And that adds a whole other dimension of suffering, the pressure to maintain appearances and the fear of social judgment and the isolation of secrecy.
It's like being betrayed twice, first by the partner and then by the situation itself. That feeling of being trapped must be incredibly difficult to navigate. Speaking of difficult, these sources also delve into the agony of suspicion, that journey from suspecting something's wrong to having it confirmed.
Yeah, that period of uncertainty can be excruciating. The sources describe people becoming these amateur detectives, scrutinizing every detail, desperately searching for clues. There's a story about a man who became so consumed by suspicion that he actually forced a confession out of his girlfriend, only to discover that his suspicions were initially unfounded.
Oh, wow. That's a cautionary tale about how suspicion can become like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Hmm.
It also seems like a missed opportunity for honest and open communication,
Yeah.
which, while difficult, is probably crucial in situations like this.
Absolutely. And of course, we can't talk about suspicion without addressing the devastating impact of gaslighting. This is where the unfaithful partner manipulates their partner into doubting their own sanity, denying the truth even when confronted with evidence.
We see this dynamic play out in Ruby's story. She suspected her partner JP was being unfaithful, but he kept denying it, telling her she was crazy and paranoid. By the time she found concrete proof, the betrayal was just amplified because she had been made to question her own perception of reality.
Yeah, Ruby's experience is a classic example of gaslighting. To help you understand this better, it's important to define it clearly. Gaslighting is a form of emotional abuse that involves manipulating someone into questioning their own thoughts, feelings, and even their sanity. It's about control and shifting blame.
So when JP tells Ruby she's crazy for suspecting him, he's not just denying the affair, he's actively trying to undermine her confidence in her own judgment. That's incredibly insidious. It makes me wonder, if JP had just been upfront and honest, how might that have changed things? Would the pain have been less intense?
That's a really interesting question, and one that the sources don't necessarily answer definitively. However, they do offer some insights into how the timing of a betrayal can play a significant role in shaping the experience. Imagine, for instance, discovering infidelity during pregnancy, illness, or like a major life milestone.
It's like the question becomes not just, how could you do this to me, but how could you do this to me now? The betrayal feels especially cruel because it occurs during a time of vulnerability. The sources offer some truly heartbreaking examples, like the woman who finds out about her husband's affair while she's in her third trimester, feeling trapped and unable to confront him.
Exactly. That now becomes a central point of pain. In her case, not only is she dealing with the betrayal, but also with the fear of jeopardizing her pregnancy if she confronts him. The weight of those circumstances adds a whole other layer of complexity.
This has been a lot to unpack, and I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of how deeply infidelity can impact people's lives. What are your thoughts so far?
I agree, it's a deeply complex issue. The sources we've explored have highlighted the profound ways in which infidelity isn't simply about cheating. It's about trust and vulnerability and the intricate ways in which our individual experiences and circumstances shape our reactions.
Before we move on to the next part of our deep dive, I want to turn to you, the listener. What's resonating with you the most from these initial insights?
We'll be back soon to delve further into the specific types of infidelity and their unique consequences.
Welcome back to our deep dives into infidelity. We've been exploring this idea that there's no single way to measure the pain of betrayal and how individual experiences and circumstances play a huge role. Now, I'm curious about something else that these sources bring up, the level of planning involved in an affair. Does that impact how the betrayal is experienced?
It absolutely does. You can imagine how different it would feel to discover a betrayal that was carefully orchestrated versus one that was more impulsive or careless. While both are painful, the sources suggest they hurt in distinct ways.
That makes sense. It's like the difference between feeling intentionally disregarded versus carelessly overlooked. Do the sources offer any examples of how this plays out in real life?
They do. One story that stood out was Charlotte's experience. She discovered her husband Steve's elaborate system for meeting high-end escorts. And what made the betrayal even more painful for her wasn't just the act itself, but the meticulous planning that went into it. It felt like a calculated decision to exclude her from a part of his life.
It's like he was actively trying to erase her from the equation during those encounters. It makes me wonder if confronting those details directly, the steps he took, the choices he made, if that added to her pain or helped her process it.
I think that confronting those details was a way for Charlotte to regain a sense of control in a situation where she felt powerless. It's also a reminder that the way we discover infidelity, the clues we uncover, the conversations we have, can significantly impact how we process the betrayal.
So on the other end of the spectrum, we have what the sources refer to as careless cheating, these impulsive acts that might not involve the same level of premeditation. Would you say those are easier to forgive, given that they might not be driven by a conscious desire to hurt the other person?
That's where it gets really interesting. You might think that a betrayal fueled by impulsivity would be easier to process, but the sources suggest that that's not always the case. Take Rick, for example. He describes his girlfriend's infidelity as a spur-of-the-moment fling. But instead of feeling relieved that it wasn't premeditated, he felt even more hurt by the lack of emotional investment. It felt meaningless and disrespectful.
So it's like even though there wasn't a deliberate intention to hurt him, the carelessness of the act itself felt like a betrayal of the relationship.
I'm sensing a pattern here. It's not just about the act of infidelity, but about the way it makes the betrayed partner feel. Disregarded, unimportant, replaced. That's a really insightful observation. And speaking of feeling, the sources dive into a particularly painful type of infidelity, affairs with exes. These can be especially devastating because they tap into deep-seated fears and insecurities.
It's the ultimate what-if scenario, isn't it? If your partner chooses to rekindle a past romance, it can make you question everything about your relationship and your place in their life.
Exactly. The sources highlight this fear of replacement that often emerges in these situations. It's the worry that you were never truly the one, merely a temporary stand-in until the real love returned.
We see this play out in Helen's story. She and Miles were together for 18 years when he had an affair with his ex-wife, Maura. Helen was left grappling with this agonizing question of whether her entire relationship had been a detour in Miles' journey back to his first love.
Helen's story is heartbreaking, and it highlights how affairs with exes can shake the very foundation of a relationship. It's like being forced to confront the ghosts of your partner's past and grapple with the possibility that those ghosts still hold more weight than your present relationship.
This deep dive has been so insightful in helping me understand the emotional complexities of infidelity, but I'm also curious about the more tangible consequences. The sources mention things like financial ruin, the the risk of STDs, and even unexpected pregnancies. It seems like the impact goes far beyond the emotional realm.
You're absolutely right. Infidelity can have these devastating real-world consequences that further complicate the experience and the path to healing.
For example, one of the sources describes a woman who discovered her husband's long-standing habit of hiring prostitutes. She was not only furious about the betrayal, but also about the immense amount of money he had squandered over the years. It was a financial violation on top of an emotional one. Absolutely. And in another source, we meet Tim, who is struggling to cope with his partner Mike's multiple hookups. Tim's anger and hurt are amplified by the anxiety of waiting for STD test results, not knowing if his physical health has been compromised as well. Those are such powerful reminders that infidelity is not just a private matter between two people. It can have these far-reaching consequences that impact health, finances, and even future family planning.
You're right. The sources even touch on the incredibly complex situation of discovering a partner has fathered a child with someone else. It's a scenario that brings up a whirlwind of emotions, betrayal, anger, grief, and perhaps even an unexpected sense of connection to this child who is a living reminder of the infidelity.
It's a situation with no easy answers. How do you navigate the relationship with your partner? What about the child? It seems like the ripple effects of infidelity can extend far beyond the initial betrayal.
It's clear that infidelity is about so much more than just sex and lies. It's about money, health, family, and this intricate web of relationships that make up our lives.
This has been an incredibly informative deep dive so far. But before we move on to our final segment, I want to check in with you, the listener. What's standing out to you as particularly significant?
Take a moment to reflect on these insights. We'll be back soon to discuss what we can learn from these experiences and how they can inform our own approach to relationships.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into infidelity. We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? Exploring the emotional nuances of betrayal, the different types of infidelity, and the far-reaching consequences that can impact not just the individuals involved, but also their entire network of relationships.
We've really challenged the notion that there's a simple formula for understanding infidelity. These sources demonstrate that it's a deeply complex issue shaped by a myriad of factors.
One of the most significant takeaways for me is that there's no hierarchy of hurt when it comes to infidelity. What might seem like a minor betrayal to one person can be absolutely devastating to another. It all comes back to that concept of individual experiences and sensitivities.
The sources really drive that point home. They're filled with stories that shatter the myth that we can objectively measure the pain of infidelity. It's a deeply personal experience influenced by everything from our personal histories to the specific circumstances surrounding the betrayal.
Yeah, and the stories we've discussed highlight how the same action committed under different circumstances can trigger vastly different reactions. That's where the idea of magnifiers and buffers really resonated with me. It provides a framework for understanding why some people seem more resilient than others in the face of betrayal.
Those concepts drawn from the sources you provided are so valuable. They remind us that infidelity doesn't occur in a vacuum. If someone is already dealing with a magnifier like financial stress or a past trauma, the impact of infidelity is likely to be even more severe. On the other hand, having a strong support network or a robust sense of self can act as a buffer, helping to mitigate the pain.
It's almost like a recipe for heartache, isn't it? You take the act of betrayal and then factor in all these variables, personal history, time, and context, and that determines the intensity of the experience. It certainly paints a more nuanced picture than simply labeling something as cheating.
It certainly does. It moves us away from judgment and towards a deeper understanding of the human experience. It also underscores the importance of individual sensitivity and support. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to healing from infidelity. Each person needs to find their own path, guided by their own needs and values.
And that path might not always involve staying in the relationship. It's important to acknowledge that not everyone chooses to rebuild after infidelity, and that's okay.
Absolutely. It's a deeply personal decision, and there's no right or wrong answer. Some people find a way to forgive, rebuild trust, and move forward, while others decide that the damage is irreparable and choose to separate.
The key is to make a conscious choice, one that feels aligned with your own values and what you believe is best for your well-being. And to remember that seeking support and guidance during this process, whether from a therapist or a trusted friend or support group, is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength and self-care.
I think that's an important message to emphasize. You're not alone in this. Even in the face of betrayal, there is always hope for healing and growth.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought. We've explored the complexities of infidelity, the different ways it can manifest, and the profound impact it can have on individuals and relationships. How might these insights inform your own approach to relationships? What are your non-negotiables when it comes to trust and commitment?
Infidelity is a challenging topic, but by understanding its nuances, we can navigate the landscape of love and relationships with more awareness, compassion, and resilience. Thank you for joining